Right, well, it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Richard Smith, who I've known for 40 years at least. Richard, tell me where and when you were born.
I was born in the village of Sybil Henningham in North Essex, although my parents were born respectively in Castle and Sybil Henningham, so they were a kind of endogamous marriage, which I've spent most of my life trying to prove is not characteristic of the English population. And my father came from Castle Henningham, which is one of the seats of the De Veres, Earls of Oxford. So I always thought that the village he came from was the one I'd really want to have been born in, and it had a status that Sybil Henningham didn't quite possess, although they both had rather interesting place names. And I'm quite sure that the Castle Henningham connection has something to do with the way my life subsequently evolved.
Really? How is that?
Well, I still remember a volume that my grandmother, who had served as a cook in the house at the castle, which was a rather grand Tudor house. She had a history of the castle, and as a sort of lad, I suppose about 7, looking at this and beginning to realise that I did live in a community that had some genuine history to it, and I'm sure it had some kind of at least indirect influence on the way I thought about things that interested me subsequently. And as a result of that, getting to know the fact that the church had an unusually early Norman nave, which I then began to recognise what sort of Romanesque architecture looked like, and going to a small country grammar school nearby. Subsequently, the fact that I had a very interesting history teacher, he was interested in the fact that I could tell him about Castle Henningham, which gave me another sort of, I think, status in the class. So there's some quite odd things that you might say grow out of that sort of early experience.
Well, we'll come back to some of those things in a minute. But you mentioned your grandparents. You got to know them, and what were they like?
Yeah, I got to know particularly my grandparents on my father's side, because my grandparent, or my grandfather on my mother's side, I only knew very, very briefly. They were in a sense sort of domestic servants in a grand house. He was a gamekeeper, and she was a cook, and they were active in the local community. They had sons and daughters who they all gave sort of French names. The family, the Magenders, who'd taken over the estate.
Yes,
yeah, you may have had.
Yeah.
There are some North Essex connections that you have too, which would have linked them with you. And as they were a French family, she decided to give her children French forenames. So I had a Muriel as an aunt, a Claude, and a Victor, and my father was Louis. Which again was slightly incongruous, really, as a set of names in North Essex, in a North Essex village at the time. But thank goodness the family discontinued that practice with my generation. I got sort of
Ricciardo,
right, solid, sort of Norman names, really. But they were socialists in a sort of a very Tory community, and I'm sure that had some influence on my uncle Victor and my father, who were both very active in the local Labour Party. So the household was quite politicised. From the point of view of Labour politicians sort of popping in and out. The oddity was that, of course, it was a solidly Tory constituency, because this was Rab Butler's constituency in North Essex, a man who was greatly admired generally. Even though he had never been successful in the top echelons of the Tory party, but there was never any chance that the Labour Party would ever win this constituency. And in vain every election, the likes of Richard Crossman and Barbara Castle would sort of turn up at the village hall, and my father would have to provide tea and make them feel that they were making some sort of effort towards a socialist victory, which never happened in that constituency. But I think they were all quite interesting sort of experiences to observe as a child, particularly in an area of North Essex that was rather sleepy, to put it mildly, and one that by the time I was reaching my teens, I was only too desperate to get out of, really. Even though I had an unusually sort of lucky break in going to a small country grammar school in Earls Coombe, which the more I think about it, was really quite important. I mean, I had a history teacher, a man called Ernst Wangerman, who subsequently went on to have a chair in European history at Leeds. He had been a pupil of Christopher Hill's and had published in the Oxford series his Oxford D. Phil. And I thought that was quite exotic, really. I mean, from the point of view of the kind of teachers I'd previously known. And he was very, very encouraging, I must say, and sort of set an example. The thought of a university career and all the other things that he managed subsequently to achieve, I think, again, would have been fairly remote in that part of the world at that time.
Let's go back. We'll come back to Earls Coombe, I expect, at some point. But let's go back to your parents. What did your parents do?
My father was an apprentice joiner cabinet maker. He was a skilled craftsman, you might say, but clearly would have, I think, in a different generation, have probably been certainly a professional, I would imagine. I mean, those kinds of skills that he had as a labour agent in a constituency were, I think, indicative of that. My mother was a housewife right through her life, really, and I was an only child, which I'm sure has a lot to do with other aspects of my personality, which might emerge as we talk further. But basically, was not terribly interested in my academic career. I think she would have been quite happy if I'd ended up staying in the village in North Essex. But my father was desperate for me to get out. There's no doubt about that. I mean, he probably was thinking about all the things that he didn't, achieve himself, and that I was a kind of vehicle for that.
What were their characters like?
My father was very gregarious, much more so than I am, because I'm still a relatively shy person. And my mother was a very, very timid lady who found it very difficult, I think, to talk to people who she didn't know very, very well. But my father was outward going and was a kind of group organiser, as a trade unionist and as a labour agent. I mean, he was always running meetings and felt he could talk to anybody, really, with no qualms about it, and didn't really find it difficult talking to people who were sort of socially significantly many more rungs up the ladder than he. So I'm sure, again, he set me a good example, which I think was influential in some way. But my mother was, but she was widowed very early. He died in his 50s, so she had a long period of widowhood, and
how old were you when he died?
I was in my early 20s when not young. I mean, but certainly it meant that my mother had 35 years of widowhood, which as an only child, I did find my dealings, involvement with her were often quite complicated, particularly because I was not living in North Essex, but getting married in the United States, and then coming back, oddly enough, to Cambridge initially, which meant that I was very, very close physically. It wasn't very far from here to Sybil Headingham. I mean,
did you say when you were born? What date?
I was born in 46.
46.
I think I must have been conceived on VE night. It looks like pretty much close to sort of sometime in early May in 1945.
Well, as a demographer, you should.
I'm very interested in that sort of moment in the post-war, immediate post-war period, you might say.
What is your earliest memory? I mean, not one that you think someone has told
Very
you.
interesting. I think my earliest memory was in the garden with my mother's father, who was tall, 6'3", had been a professional soldier, and I still have a memory of him gardening. I somehow with runner beans in the background. It must have been some of the combination of the height of this man and the runner beans. I can still remember it quite vividly.
Can you remember the flowers?
The flowers on the beans, the red flowers. Yes, interesting. And
it's quite often these early memories are something against the sky.
Yeah.
Trees waving. Or something.
It could have been, the sort of silhouette of him and the beans in his garden.
That's nice. At that time, I mean, well, a little later, say when you were 6, 7, 8, 9 in North Essex, were you a nature boy? I mean, what were your hobbies and interests?
Oh, like I suppose many of my primary school sort of peers, we were interested in collecting birds' eggs, much to my shame nowadays. So springtime was a very active period of looking for your more exotic eggs, because we all had egg collections that we kept, and it was quite a competitive sort of activity. Yeah, and I had 2 uncles who were farmers. One very close to Sybil Headingham in Witham in Essex, and another one who was a fenland farmer who'd married my mother's sisters. So there was a farming connection, and most vacations, particularly school vacations, I tried to get to one of their farms, and my uncle in North Cambridgeshire, out in the Cambridgeshire Fens, I worked for him from about the age of 10 right through my university years, every summer, helping bring in the harvest, something which I'm sure again was influential.
Well, I was going to say, someone who studies medieval agrarian economic history and so on, it seems this might have been an interest that spread into that.
Yeah, I think having a feel for the agricultural seasons and the sort of difficulties of managing the environment, even in 20th century sort of farming technology, could have been helpful.
Yeah.
You'd asked me about whether I was a nature boy. I suppose also North Essex really with fairly intensely cultivated landscape. I mean, it's an area of farming where there's not much wild or at least untrained vegetation. But my memory is we always tried to get into the river valley and the river Cone. So that was an area we spent a lot of time sort of damming sort of streams that fed into the Cone, or in those days, I mean, watching or looking for otters, and fishing in one of the mills. I mean, again, there were at least 2 old Domesday Book mills that are still there, that had mill ponds that we fished in. So that was something I still have sets of photographs of myself and friends sitting around this mill pond.
Perch and pike and
that's right, yeah, perch and pike and
chub,
and of course the minor sticklebacks that used to sort of be netted out.
Lovely. It sounds a nice childhood. And you went to a primary school just nearby?
I went to a Church of England primary school in the village, and I still have quite vivid memories. I mean, this was a school that must have been built very soon after the 1870 Education Act, so it had a very Edwardian, if you like, or late Victorian Edwardian feel. We still had great coke stoves in the classrooms to heat what were not terribly well equipped classrooms. And I have again a vivid memory of the smell of coke burning in the mornings, where I think the head teacher must have stoked up these coke fires during the winter, and it's a very I think memorable sort of odour, I think, of of coke burning, particularly as we frequently, if we arrived wet, having walked through the rain, the head teacher would then hang our clothes around on railings around this coke fire. So the combination, I think, of wet clothes drying with the coke, I think, sort of pervaded these classrooms. During the winter, and of course it was still 11 plus days. So
so you took the 11 plus.
Took the 11 plus,
and that's how you got into the grammar school.
I went into the local, a small country grammar school in
Well, tell me about that, because for those watching, I have a particular interest in Earlscone. So tell me about Earlscone at that time in the grammar school.
Well, it was a small grammar school. It only had about 180 pupils, probably a sixth form of about a dozen, 6 in the upper and 6 in the lower. 6 each in the classes, I suppose, were about 25, 30.
It's just behind the church, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just behind the church in York Road, as you're coming down the main thoroughfare. And of course, we did do all the things that you'd expect. We had carol services in the church at Christmas. In fact, the head teacher was a Downing man, a man called James Sykes, who'd been there since about 1934, when I went in 1957. No idea that I'd end up in Downing College, and I tried to find his record in the college archive, and there was barely anything about him, so I never really discovered much. But it was a good grammar school, I think, in retrospect. I mean, the quality of the teaching, I think, was very high. I mean, there were only 11 members of staff. Half of them were Oxbridge graduates, so again, I was very lucky in that regard. And it had a boarding house.
You did?
A small boarding house, so there were about 30 boarders. The rest of us were day boys. And having the boarders in the school, I think, again, made the place more interesting than it would have been otherwise. It meant that things went on in the school all the week, every day in the week, and there were quite a lot of activities after conventional school hours. So it wasn't the standard sort of, or bog standard grammar school in that regard. And as a result of that, there were two teachers who lived in, one being Ernst Wangerman, the history teacher, and he had a huge library, I remember. Well, at least to me it looked like a very large library. It probably wouldn't now, but and he would frequently ask boys to go into Colchester, I remember, to borrow books during school hours. He would send them off on the bus, and they would come back from the public library, where for some reason they were able to use his ticket. But no, I slightly regretted the fact that as I got older, the range of subjects that a small country grammar school of that size was able to offer was not very, very broad. But
what did you do?
Well, I mean, I did for my O levels, the standard mixture of Latin, French, English language, literature, and art, religious education, I think I took, and physics, chemistry, and maths. I think that was, and I wasn't sure at the age of 16 what A levels I would take. I ended up taking history, geography, and French, and in the end, I think that was okay. I enjoyed them, but
were there any other sort of extracurricular things that you were enthusiastic about?
I got quite involved in school drama. I did more of that as I got into my sort of what would have been 4th and 5th year. I was a very keen cricketer.
Were you? Are you still?
I still am, and now that I've had 2 cataract operations, minor though they are, I can now see the ball again. It was always difficult to play cricket with that visual impairment. When I was in Oxford, I used to play for the Trojan Wanderers. Jack Pohl, do you remember? Who was professor of American history. He had a team that were all supposedly made up of Berlioz enthusiasts. So they'd somehow went. So I played that, and I played also with someone who you know very well, who was a very, very good cricketer, colleague of mine in All Souls, Robin Briggs. another Essex lad who grew up in Braintree and
right.
Colchester.
Mm.
So cricket's always been quite important to me as a sort of an outlet. I'm not very athletic, but there's something cerebral about cricket, and the pace is about right, and the kind of strategies. Playing a cricket match is a bit like writing an academic paper. I think. But at school that was one of my enthusiasts, and I've only recently reconnected with my old cricket master, who still lives in the town of Houston, just not very far from where I now live, and he was the geography teacher as well. I think frequently the case that geography teachers and games players went together in those days, and it's been quite interesting talking to him about all the teachers that who taught me that he knew, and what he thought they were really like behind the scenes. Is always an intriguing sort of opportunity to get beneath the surface with these people, so some of the people who I thought were remarkably fine, upstanding citizens turn out to be quite different, when you get to know them. But it was an interesting. I mean, I living in Hedingham and going on the bus every day, about 8 miles to Earl's Combe, was sort of a kind of ritual that we went through in those days.
Was Reuben Hunt and the work?
Yes, so Reuben Hunt was then the chairman of the governors at Earl's Combe, and of course, you may know, of course, he lived in Cone Priory,
Yes.
and where the Hunt family obviously had done very well for themselves. Yes, and
was the works still?
yes, the works were still fully operational, and it gave Earl's Combe a rather interesting sort of industrial air at the time, because there were terraced houses where a lot of the men who worked in the foundry lived, and they came out of the foundry looking rather black and in their overalls. I mean, it's not the sort of thing you normally expected to see in a North Essex town. Well, North Essex in that regard had some rather interesting anomalies, because Halstead had a textile firm. Courtaulds were there, and there were textile mills where my mother worked, incidentally, before she married, and then when she married she stopped. She was a weaver, a silk weaver,
Really?
and during the war weaving silk for parachute. But again, there were these little sort of leftovers really from. I don't know how Reuben Hunt's foundry emerged. I should know that, but of course, Courtaulds' presence in Halstead and Braintree and Bocking were quite important sort of soppers up of surplus labour in this relatively impoverished area in the early 19th century, when they moved out of East London.
It's an interesting sort of mirror 4 centuries later of the new draperies coming into that area.
It's a kind of
with the same sort of people, Dutch kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. These Dutch sort of Huguenot or Huguenot families. I mean, Courtaulds, of course, continue to be important right up until the 1970s as textile sort of firms in the community. So again, there was a sort of connection, and I remember when the former professor of economic history here, Donald Coleman, wrote a great 3-volume history of the Courtaulds, which I think enabled him to buy a very substantial sort of manor house in Cavendish, not very far from where I live now. And there are a couple of pages showing the wage books of weavers in the late 19th century. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was also a weaver there in the 1880s and 90s. And there's a page with her name, Emily Brett, sort of there. And that I remember telling him about this. He didn't believe it, but so
he was a cynical man.
Yeah.
Just finally, really on the school. Well, 2 things. One is you mentioned Berlioz, and that wasn't your choice for perhaps, but was music at all important?
It was important, because the head teacher, who was a classicist, was very, very keen on music, good pianist, and I played piano in a very rudimentary fashion. I didn't take up any other instrument, and we didn't have a piano at home, so it was always difficult for me to practice in the way that I would have liked. I wish I had, been able to develop. But James Sykes, this head teacher, was very encouraging, and he was also very keen on developing school choir. And I like to sing in a choral context. I have a sort of half-baked tenor voice, which
have you continued?
No, regrettably. When I was an undergraduate, I should have done this, but I think I was too much of a swot. Really, I got too involved in academic things. And
what about listening to music?
Oh, I really like to listen to music, and I mean, I presume I have a very conventional set of likes and dislikes. I mean, I particularly like Bach. I like complexity of Bach, and I'm also very romantic, so I do like Slavonic composers who send me into sort of distant places, and
do you think any of the music feeds into your work? Some people say that they listen to music, and I mean Maitland, for example, it's been suggested that you can detect the sound of Wagner or other music in his writing, and he used to listen to music while he was writing.
I don't know. I'm not a great stylist, and there's a sort of complexity to my sentence structures which might perhaps reflect Bach somewhere, but I don't know. that would be a sort of one way of thinking about it. I can listen to music and write. It may mean that I'm not listening as carefully as I should be, but I also have in the last 15 years become very interested in jazz. I mean, I regularly go to a jazz club now, at least once a month, which is something I didn't know I would ever sort of take up. But again, I like jazz piano for the same reason. It's complexity. There's I think a lot that's similar between intricate jazz playing and listening to Bach in its various forms. Really.
The other thing is that around 16, most people in such circumstances get confirmed. I don't know if you were.
I was.
And which opens up the whole question of religion, because it's sometimes a time when questions one's traditional.
It's an interesting issue here. I mean, my father, a socialist, was also a kind of one of these Anglican socialists. I mean, he thought there was he thought there was something fundamental about I suppose the ideas all associated with Jesus Christ and his socialist leanings. And I'm not sure whether I did. I probably went through the motions, unfortunately, just to please my father, of getting confirmed and going to church. I suppose during my teens, at least to morning service every Sunday. Really.
But after that?
After that, really, once I went into my sixth form, I was already resisting it. But I suppose I'm very, very conventional in that regard. I'm a non-believer, but I still find sitting in a medieval church a sort of quasi-spiritual sort of experience.
Ellescombe is a nice church, isn't it?
Very nice church. And where I live in Clare,
it's a lovely church.
We have, and I do like to listen to music in churches. I mean, there's something called the Suffolk Religious Festival, which I think is run out actually at the University of Essex, but they have regular Baroque music sort of concerts in the churches of Polstead, Hadley, Stoke-by-Nayland, and it's just a marvellous way to go and listen to Baroque music, and I sometimes have sort of sensations when I'm in the church that get the better of me, I think.
Yeah, sort of Wordsworthian moments.
Yeah, right.
So you're not violently hostile to religion in the Dawkins kind of...
No, I'm not.
way.
I'm not at all. And I suppose that's one reason why I have great sympathy for Martin Rees this last week or so, for those reasons as well. But
this is a reference to the his winning of a large prize for religion and science. Okay, well, you must have, the geography, history were moving you towards that direction.
Yeah.
And was any university an obvious choice? Or?
Not really. I mean, my school didn't have much of a reputation for sending people to either Oxford or Cambridge. The deputy headmaster's son, I think, went as a chemist. And James Sykes said that, well, you won't get into Oxford or Cambridge, but you might get into University College London. You know, the sort of next best thing, or whatever it was. And I didn't really know whether I wanted to do geography or history. I got an interview to read geography at University College London, and it was odd. I knew nothing about the department really in terms of its qualities or the people there, but I was interviewed then by the head of department, who was then Clifford Darby.
Oh yes, from King's.
From King's, although he came back to King's when he moved to Cambridge. And this would have been I suppose it was the winter of '65. I went up in obviously October of '65. But I did not know that he was a distinguished historical geographer, that he was a doomsday scholar. And I really didn't know what historical geography was. It was not something that the A-level curriculum introduced you to. But it was, I think, fortunate because it ensured that I kept my history and geography in some kind of active form as an undergraduate geographer, and I became more and more interested in the historical, if you like, economic historical.
You got into University College?
Yeah, I got into University College, and Darby gave a heavily choreographed, I might add, set of lectures that the whole of the University of London, so to speak, used to come to in UCL on the making of the English landscape. And of course, he had a competitor in W.G. Hoskins.
Yes, I was going to ask what
at the time.
What the relationship was.
And Hoskins, I think, was fundamentally more interesting because he was a more interesting human being. But there was something about Darby's approach. He certainly did bring things in the landscape and the settlement geography and place name studies and the early sort of work that he did on the distribution of serfs in the Domesday Book alive to me, and of course you could relate to it quite quickly because if you came from East Anglia, I mean there were certain distinctive features about the Domesday geography of East Anglia which again made it interesting to me. I could see how what he was doing did have an influence, and I remember we had a seminar where we had to present papers on key source materials. This would be in the second year, and this would be 1966, and I was assigned the parish register to write about. And it so happened that, of course, in that year, Tony Wrigley and Peter Laslett were giving lectures on the old third programme,
about family reconstitution.
That's right. 1966 was when the Introduction to English Historical Photography was published, and I bought a copy, and you may remember it had a vivid red cover with black type on it, and I gave this presentation, and I don't think Darby, who was running the class, had even seen the book. It just so happened that I strolled across the road to Dillon's bookshop opposite, and got a copy, and he must have been quite taken aback by this. But I said the only reason I knew about it was because I'd heard Peter Laslett on the third programme talking, and in the same series, Tony Wrigley gave an early version of the Importance of London paper, that very, very influential paper, again, which struck me as very interesting. And of course, he was introduced as a lecturer in geography at the University of Cambridge, but having collaborated with Peter Laslett. And so it seemed to me to think, oh, that's quite interesting that a geographer could be doing this kind of, not that I that I knew at the time that he'd also got a first in history from Cambridge. So he really was more than just a geographer. But then I went to a dinner, a Geographical Society dinner, where I sat next to a very exotic character who had just come to UCL, a man called Paul Wheatley.
I know. Yes.
And he'd been at Berkeley, and I was sitting next to him, and he said he thought the only interesting thing that was going on in British history at the time was what Peter Laslett was doing, and I thought, well, it's quite interesting that this rather exotic, who again was very influential. I mean, he was working then on the religious underpinnings of urban origins in China, and he had worked on similar issues in Southeast Asia. A book he wrote on the Caronese, but he wrote this book, The Pivot of the Four Quarters, which was an attempt to sort of bring Fousteau de Coulanges into sort of prominence, and the whole and he introduced me to Karl Polanyi and that sort of dimension of economic anthropology. I remember as an undergraduate, because he was very interested in the whole question of how, as he put it, the shift from redistributional to reciprocal to redistributional arrangements would underpin urban growth, and he was trying to sort of fit this to, I think, Chinese evidence, and this again struck me as very, very interesting, and the sort of thing that I wasn't really being exposed to in any other context in my undergraduate curriculum. I'm not even sure whether it's the sort of thing you would have come across in a more conventional historical or even anthropological setting at the time. So he was really quite important, and he was trying to persuade me by the time I was graduating to go off to the University of Sheffield to learn Japanese. So he thought that really I ought, because he knew I had an interest in population related matters, and he knew enough about the quality of the Japanese sort of record, and I don't think Hayami had started sort of his pioneering work in Japanese registers. But he said, well, you could make yourself a name for yourself. I mean, if you go and work on these Japanese sources, because nobody else will be, and you've got to spend, like I did, X years on this. But of course, I wanted to work on medieval topics, and Darby moved from University College London to take the chair here in 1967. And I graduated in '68 and came to work with him as a postgraduate student.
You say, of course, you wanted to work on medieval.
Well, I'm jumping the gun here. It was just that, I mean, Darby's work on things like the medieval Fenland and the reconstruction of the sort of characteristics of the population distribution, settlement geography of the Fens, and having spent a lot of my youthful vacations in fields in about 12 miles from Ely, looking at the cathedral looming across this landscape as we were, bringing the harvest in. It did sort of draw me in a way, and I was always interested in issues to do with why the Fens were so prosperous in terms of their underlying sort of income per capita. You looked at the lay subsidies, and you saw this area which looked in principle to be bereft of people having such high per capita income, so I came up, but I wanted to work on North Essex and Suffolk. Again, I was interested in the early development of the textile industry. I'd read Joan Thirst's essay on industries in the countryside as an undergraduate, and her ideas about the links between particle inheritance and the fragmentation of holdings and development of industry as a by-employment. I thought, well, I wonder whether this can be made to work in North Essex and South Suffolk, and I discovered that, of course, this wasn't an area of particle inheritance at all. It was an area where, as far as I could work out, it was primarily primogeniture. But so I spent a year with Darby trying to map fulling mills as indicators of industrial development along the rivers Colne and Stour. I still have of these rather rudimentary mapping exercises that I went through, but I got really very bored with that kind of static sort
We
of
got to see some lovely Constable paintings, but
yes, but it so happened that I alighted on a manor where I'd found part of an inheritance in the British Library, a place called Rickinghall, and it was an old manor of it was a manor of the Bury St Edmunds estates, and I was having really to teach myself to read manorial documents, because within the geography department there was very little formal training in these sorts of things. I doubt there would have been much in the history faculty actually if I'd been there either. But I got to.
Wasn't John Saltmarsh know how to read?
Well, John Saltmarsh was a figure who I think Clifford Derby rather revered, and he thought that I wasn't really the kind of material that should be sent to John Saltmarsh. I did go to the university reader in paleography, who was a fellow of no college. He was a reader. I can't remember his name now. But he had a room in Laundress Lane, and he taught paleography to anybody who wanted to go. But he was a purist again, in the sense that he thought that we all needed to know everything about Carolingian minuscule. So he sat at the end of this very long railway carriage of a room with a box of letters, and he would pull this out, it's the Carolingian A, and we go. Then, sort of after about 3 weeks, we'd be given a piece of a facsimile to try to translate. It was impossible. T.A.M. Bishop was his name. I mean, he was quite distinguished in his own way, and left me completely, I think, without any technical skills. But those were interesting days. I don't know any of the medievalists that I was being exposed to Carolingian minuscule with. Whatever happened to them? But
Arthur Hibbert was, of course, a major
Arthur Hibbert was here.
Yeah,
and he was giving lectures on urban issues. And the only person who was really interested in what I was doing was Poston. Yeah. And I still remember him summoning me after I told him about told Tony Wrigley what I was doing, and Tony had passed this information on to Poston. He summoned me to Peterhouse, and you probably remember him too. He said, "Smith, geography is a good subject to begin with, but it's an even better subject to get out of." And I don't think I really took him seriously at the time, but there was a sort of element of that about it all.
What was Derby like as a supervisor? He was supervising your PhD.
Yeah, he wasn't really very interested in the kinds of questions I was trying to address, because they were sort of dynamic and they didn't translate into sort of geographical patterns. In other words, I was looking at processes really of social behaviour, and they wouldn't convert into the conventional sort of mapping routines that he wanted. So it was a difficult relationship for about a year and a half, and then he said, well, your interests, particularly when I gave him a piece that I'd written on the relationship between inheritance and subsequent land marketing of the sons, as to what they did with the land afterwards. And he said, well, this is really not in any sense historical geography as I know it. So he said, you better go and talk to Tony Wrigley. And Tony Wrigley then said, well, I can't really supervise this kind of stuff because he was in the geography department then. He said, but I have this young colleague who's working with me, Roger Schofield, who can read anything and did work on medieval taxation as well as Tudor taxation. Was
he still at the Public Record Office?
No, he just arrived and was working in the population group in 1967. And he had been working in the Public Record Office up until that point. And he took me on. And
it was a wonderful supervisor.
It was a wonderful, fortuitous, sort of link, really, that I think in that respect, I'm terribly grateful to Derby for kicking me off his patch, really, because.
Well, tell me about Roger, because
Roger,
I went to interview him.
You came to Cambridge first in 70. Yeah, Roger.
71.
Roger was a very exotic character because he dressed.
I remember seeing the advertisement for the post in the Institute of Historical Research. And I was already working on documents. And I thought, well, perhaps I'll apply for this, and I didn't. then realising how much better Roger would be at any such job than I could possibly have.
Well, he was. I mean, I'd read his paper on the geographical redistribution of wealth, which I think he published based on his Cambridge PhD. But he was quite exotic. He was married to an actress who was a beautiful woman. I mean, and he lived in London and commuted to Cambridge every day on the King's Cross line, as it was then, when you had to change, I think, at Hitchin or whatever before getting it. So, and I was living I was at St Catherine's. I was in a St Catherine's hostel on Panton Street, and he would cycle through en route from the station to. So I'd seen him before I became his supervisor. Cycling from the station to the old Silver Street.
He had a rather racy bike, I think.
He did, and he often used to wear a kind of
neck chief.
A neck chief, that's right, a red and white spotted one. And he wore blue denim sort of trousers and top. So he wasn't the sort of average academic sort of to look at in those days. And of course I think he mixed with a rather interesting sort of theatrical set in London when he went back in the evenings. But he was just remarkable. I mean, he immediately saw the value of the material I was working on and encouraged me I suppose it was a risky sort of encouragement in some senses, because there was no way in which it was clear how I was going to convert all this into something at the end of the day. And then, of course, I went to I needed to look at some more material which had been sold to the University of Chicago. It was part of the Nicholas Bacon collection, and the University of Chicago bought one of the key manors that I wanted to work on, Redgrave, in North Suffolk. Rickett and Manley, the people who were editing Chaucer at the University of Chicago, decided at some point in the 1920s that they wanted to teach their graduate students to read English shorthand. So these documents came up for sale, and they bought them. So this meant that the whole thing sort of ended up in the University of Chicago. No one worked on them apart from one woman called Sylvia Thrupp. And I went, but I got married
to Peggy.
To Peggy rather rapidly.
She was the archivist.
She was the archivist. Yes, it was, and
instant access to the archives.
I know. But I did have privileged access at all hours of the day, which was tremendously helpful. And in a sense, pursuing this manor in North Suffolk that no one had really worked on. I mean, I suppose again changed my life to a certain extent, because I wouldn't have gone to Chicago. I wouldn't have had an American wife, but we came back. I mean, very soon thereafter. I suppose that would have been when I came back to Cambridge in the early 70s. I just finished my PhD. I did have a period when another quite interesting medieval demographic historian acted as a sort of temporary supervisor while I was away, a man called David Helly.
Yes.
Yes, he was then at the University of Wisconsin, about an hour's drive up the freeway from Chicago, and he was working on the great Florentine Catasto, that great project, which was very interesting, and it gave me an opportunity to look at some Southern European sort of evidence and a very different type of social structure, which helped me to sort of, I think, firm up my ideas about the distinctiveness of English patterns, which were entirely unlike the things that he was talking about. And he realised it too, and encouraged me, I think, to sort of go out a bit on a limb with that, because he'd never seen English manorial documents, and he'd never seen them analysed in the way that I was sort of doing. And I think again that was rather lucky to have encouraged him in that way. Unfortunately, he moved on to Harvard, and I didn't really keep in touch with him. Then he died rather early. I mean, he got cancer quite young, and didn't really carry on doing the work that he was doing. But it was an interesting episode, really.
What was the central theme of the thesis?
The central theme, I became very interested in the relationship between inheritance, intergenerational population growth, and social networks, because I mean, I'd read Homan's on particle inheritance, and he was quite convinced that that part of inheritance led to rather complex extended family structures where you had frequently married brothers sort of either living together or living very close together, and that the fragmentation of holdings led to these structures that were very, very different from the areas where you had primogeniture and a more stem family type arrangement. So these were two sort of stereotypes really that were dominant in the literature on English peasant society, and I suppose they had a wider presence in writing about European behaviour generally. But Homans never really looked at what happened to the land after the brothers had inherited, and it became quickly apparent, that they were buying and selling, and often one brother emerged as the dominant landholder, and the rest either went off as labourers or did something very different. So there was no really strong family attachment to the land, and that's, I think, what interested me at the time, and also trying to build up the sorts of social networks that these individuals created. You could do this with the manorial court records in a way that would have been very difficult to undertake with other sources. So I think I was trying to show, first of all, that the part of inheritance driver for industrial growth and a distinctive type of social outcome didn't work. The reality was very, very far removed from the theory. So that was really an attempt to look at an inheritance sort of driven approach to social structure, which I didn't find terribly persuasive in that form. And of course I got very, very interested in the operation of the peasant land market, or the rural land market broadly defined. I suppose that's when I met you, really, very soon thereafter.
It was around that time.
Yeah.
What about the extended family theory of Homans? Did you find evidence of extended families?
It was very, very hard to find the sort of arrangements that were very durable. I mean, I found some evidence, obviously, of maintenance contracts where elderly parents were at least given space on the farmstead to coexist with their children, but they didn't, in my view, appear to be terribly persuasive evidence of them actually co-residing. I mean, the contractual basis of the relationship, the spatial arrangements, the fact that the frequent clauses setting up means by which they might have access to use the kitchen or access to the well and things, suggested that co-residing was not the underlying arrangement that sort of drove this pattern. So I suppose at the time I just become a very sceptical sort of observer on these on these patterns that had a kind of prominence in the literature, and of course it was helped enormously by the fact that I was fortunate enough to get a university, in those days, university assistant lectureship in historical geography, demography, in 1974, when Tony Wrigley gave up his post in the geography department to have a full-time appointment with then the Social Science Research Council with the Cambridge Group. I remember giving a paper in a seminar that Peter Laslett then ran in Trinity in the evenings. You probably went to
some of those, yes.
And he was very, very interested. I know it was actually a paper about illegitimacy, because I found some very interesting information in these manorial documents about women who were giving birth outside of wedlock, and I was trying to relate them to the number of fines that were being paid for marrying, so I could get some kind of a ratio of illegitimates to marriages. It was quite wrong, and I know it was a mistake in trying to do it that way. But Peter was very interested in this at the time.
Had he started his work on illegitimacy by then?
He certainly published the first paper with Carla Osterveen on illegitimacy. So he was interested in these ratios, and he said, well, they look very similar to the sorts of ratios that you would find if you plotted marriages and and bastard births in late 16th century England, and I didn't really think very much of that point. But John Heinel was also in the audience, and he said something to me about, well, can you really get at patterns of peasant marriage in these documents? He was spending a year here.
He'd already written the famous paper.
Yeah, he had, and I knew that article. I mean,
European marriage pattern.
And I said, well, I think you can, although it could be quite tricky. And then later, a few months later, they advertised a post for a research officership in the population group, and I thought, this is really too good an opportunity. I mean, I know I have a university position at the moment. It could be rather chancy taking the risky sort of step to go into a research post, but I got appointed. I know that David Levine was one of the other people who was in for that post at the time. And I thought he would get it because he'd done a conventional family reconstitution and had all of the skills. But obviously Peter and Tony just thought that this might be more interesting to develop the group's interest in that area, and I was very, very, very lucky. And I suppose you were then running a seminar, and I don't know how it came about. It was certainly before English individualism.
Yes.
That you invited me to give a talk here.
Because between about 72 and 74, I was running a seminar in King's.
Yeah, it was in 74. It was my first year here, and I gave a paper on network analysis.
Yes, you did.
And John Barnes was gave me a bit of a rough time, but he was very, very interested in it, and we spoke a lot about it subsequently. And because I was using techniques that he had really pioneered himself in that, and it must have been after that either you read my thesis or I gave you some bits of it, or
I read it.
Right, and well, then I got more interested, not so much in the manorial documentation. I got interested in trying to look for evidence of late marriage and low incidence marriage in other sources. So, and I went back to sort of reconsider the poll taxes, and that took up quite a lot of my time in the late 70s.
Well, this is a question which we may delete from the record, but I remember your thesis was terribly important as a background, and your other work as background to my book on English individualism. I remember when it came out, there was quite a bit of hostility from a number of Marxists and other historians. And I remember saying, some of them said that one or two critics wrote saying that you would have never allowed such a thing to have come out and me to use your work if you'd known what I was going to do and so on. But the thing that interested me was I asked you why you hadn't written my book, because you had all the information, you knew that most of what I was attacking was wrong. And you said, well, you're an outsider. I'm slightly paraphrasing. You're an outsider. You don't have PhD students who are dependent on jobs with these people, and so on and so on. You can say this. It's more difficult for me, right in the middle of the profession, to come out in such a radical way.
Yeah, I think I remember that conversation, and it was. I think it would if you were, so to speak, in the middle of a group of researchers who would never have sort of made those sorts of claims, or indeed really were never willing, I think, to interest themselves in quite that form. They would have thought that I was pushing the evidence beyond the point that it could really legitimately be taken. And I'm still very sympathetic to a lot of what you were doing with it, because it would be very, very difficult, I think, to have pursued the kinds of interest that I've had subsequently within the group if I were not fundamentally supportive of that underlying view, because it did require one to sort of to start to look at what was actually happening, rather than assuming that things should take a particular form if they're going to abide by any kind of sort of evolutionary development. And of course, Poston was never really fully persuaded, and I think partly because of the diagnosis that you, to some extent, made in English individualism or somewhere else. I mean, another Russian.
Well, there's names like Titov,
Yeah.
Boston, Homans,
Kosminski,
Kosminski, Vinogradov.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we had these very, very eminent and very able people of East European sort of origins who brought that baggage into their interpretation of medieval England. There was no question about it. So they would have found it very, very hard. I always found it, though, very difficult to understand why as economic historians at the time, even though Doomsday scholars revered Maitland, that they didn't really read Maitland and didn't really sort of take him on board in the context of thinking about other features of the social structure. It was a very interesting a kind of absence from the from the literature and discussion. I mean, you rarely, and of course, for the most part, these people did not interest themselves in the law either. I mean, you had to sort of subscribe to the view that customary law, as it was supposedly enacted and practiced in the manorial courts, was a very different animal from anything that came out of the common law courts, and it quickly became apparent that it wasn't. I mean, that interested me quite a lot for a period after that. I got involved in helping to establish a new legal history journal, the Law History Review, that was then being sort of run out of Cornell, which again seemed odd for anybody who was sort of historical geographer, demographer, and a sort of kind of early family historian. So the customary law and common law sort of issues continue to interest me. I still sort of dabble in those sorts of areas, and of course Hilton had been so adamant that the common law and manorial law were so different animals that they were never part and parcel of any kind of continuum, that it was impossible to have a kind of constructive dialogue with him on those matters. I suppose you would also remember sort of difficult relations with someone like Hilton.
Very, I do.
At the time.
Yeah,